The morning they won the lottery, the whole house felt sharp and electric, like the air right before a storm breaks. I watched my son and daughter-in-law freeze over a piece of paper they had no right to claim, their excitement swelling so fast it swallowed every trace of the woman who had cooked their meals and folded their laundry just hours earlier. In that moment, I felt myself slipping into the background of my own life. If you've ever trusted someone only to feel yourself disappear in the process, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You're not alone. What they didn't realize, what they never even thought to check, was whose name was printed on that ticket. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember the sting of that morning, the way the air in the room shifted when my son and his wife realized they were holding a winning lottery ticket. $53 million? It should have been a joyful moment for all of us, but instead I watched greed wash over their faces like a shadow they didn't bother hiding. In their excitement, I could almost hear the unspoken message beneath their voices. The feeling that my small monthly contribution no longer mattered and that my presence in their home had suddenly become an inconvenience they no longer needed to tolerate. What struck me most wasn't their celebration, but the way they seemed to forget something simple, something almost laughably obvious. They never once stopped to think about whose name was printed on that ticket. They just assumed it was theirs, as if everything I touched somehow belonged to them by default. In that moment, I felt a mixture of disbelief and a quiet, simmering hurt I didn't dare show on my face. Still, beneath all of that pain, there was a flicker of something else, an awareness that this moment was only the surface of a much deeper story. To understand how we reached that point, I need to take you back to the life I had before everything began to unravel. Before everything began to shift, my life moved at a quieter, steadier pace. I was 68, still learning how to live in a world without my husband, Michael. Grief has a way of blurring the edges of time, but some habits kept me grounded. One of them was my weekly walk to the corner store every Friday morning. I had been playing the same lottery numbers for more than 30 years, each one tied to a moment in my life that still felt sacred. A birthday here, an anniversary there, small pieces of a story I wasn't ready to let go of. Those numbers were less about luck and more about memory, a way of keeping the people I loved close to me. When Michael passed, the house we shared suddenly felt enormous. Friends meant well when they suggested I move in with someone, and eventually I convinced myself it was practical to accept Andrew and Lydia's offer. They had space, they said. Families should stick together, they said. And I wanted to believe that stepping into their home would soften the ache of being alone. In the beginning, I tried to ignore the small signs of discomfort, the subtle pauses or glances that made me feel like an unexpected weight in their routine. I brushed it off as my own insecurity, telling myself it would pass with time. But beneath that hope lingered a quiet worry I couldn't quite name. Looking back now, those early whispers of unease were the first steps toward a much deeper shift, one that would reveal itself slowly, day by day, as my place in their home began to change. The first month in Andrew and Lydia's home felt almost gentle. I kept to myself, cooked meals when I felt up to it, and helped with small things around the house. It felt good to be useful, to feel like I was contributing without being a burden. I told myself the arrangement was working, that we were finding a rhythm as a family, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of everything began to shift. What started as voluntary help quietly became expectation. If laundry wasn't folded, I noticed the lingering glances. If dinner wasn't already simmering on the stove, there was a tension in the air I could feel more than hear. I convinced myself that I was overthinking it, that they were simply busy with their own responsibilities. Still, I could feel my role changing, slipping from guest to caretaker without anyone ever saying it aloud. Then came the finances. Lydia sat me down one morning with numbers neatly written out, explaining how much my share of the household expenses should be. I remember staring at the total, realizing it swallowed nearly all of my monthly income. I told myself it was temporary, that contributing was fair, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. The real turning point came when I overheard Lydia talking to a friend during one of their gatherings. The light, almost amused tone she used when describing my presence in the house made something inside me collapse a little. She spoke as if I were an obligation they were cleverly managing, rather than a mother trying her best to fit into a life that no longer felt like her own. By then, I could no longer ignore the truth. The small favors had turned into routine labor, the shared home into something resembling a workplace. And as winter crept in, so did the realization that this descent was only beginning. The breaking point, though, was still waiting for me in December. December settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, the kind that muffles sound and makes every step feel harder than it should. That morning, the wind cut straight through my coat as I made my way to the corner store for my weekly lottery ticket. The snow was already piling up, forcing me to walk slowly, and with every careful step, I felt the weight of the past 2 years pressing deeper into my chest. I found myself thinking about the home Michael and I once shared, the warmth that used to greet me when I walked through the front door, and how different everything felt now. By the time I returned to Andrew and Lydia's house, the chill outside had seeped into me. I overheard Lydia speaking to a contractor, her tone brisk and businesslike, describing a plan for a basement suite she expected I would move into by spring. She spoke as if I were simply another appliance being rearranged to improve the layout. Hearing that stripped something tender inside me. I realized then that my presence in their main living space wasn't just inconvenient, it was something they were actively working to minimize. I stood there in the hallway, holding my ticket with numb fingers, letting the truth settle. I was becoming smaller in their world, quietly pushed into corners until I disappeared altogether. And as the storm picked up outside, I felt another storm rising in me, one that would soon change everything. It was late that night, the kind of quiet where the whole house feels suspended in its own breath. I sat alone in the living room, half listening to the television while trying to shake off the weight of the day. The lottery numbers flashed across the screen, and out of habit, I reached for the ticket I had tucked into my sweater pocket. I wasn't expecting anything. Those numbers had been more of a ritual than a real hope for as long as I could remember. But as each number appeared, something inside me jolted awake. One matched, then another, and suddenly the room felt impossibly still. By the time the final number appeared, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I sat there frozen, staring at the ticket, wondering if grief or exhaustion had finally scrambled my senses. I checked again, slowly, deliberately. There was no mistake. I had won. My first instinct was to call out for Andrew and Lydia, to share the kind of joy that should overflow a home. But the thought stopped almost as quickly as it came. The past months had shown me exactly where I stood in this household, And this moment, this miracle, felt too precious to hand over to people who had treated me like an afterthought. So I held it close, letting the possibility of change bloom quietly inside me. I knew this silence wouldn't last forever. Something was coming, and the house would not stay calm for long. Saturday mornings in that house usually carried a predictable rhythm: coffee brewing, dishes clattering, and Lydia moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who always seemed slightly irritated. I had left my purse on the counter after returning from the store the day before, thinking nothing of it. I was wiping down the table when I heard her rummaging through it, muttering about needing a coupon she thought she'd misplaced. A moment later, everything shifted. I felt the air tighten before I even turned around. She had found the ticket, the one I had tucked carefully into a side pocket. I could see the shock on her face as she stared at the numbers, and before I could even take a breath, Andrew came rushing in, drawn by the sound of her excitement. They spiraled quickly, already making plans, already assuming that this sudden fortune was theirs to distribute and shape however they pleased. I stood there, watching the two of them build castles in the air, speaking about futures that didn't seem to include me except as an afterthought. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, and another part wanted to cry at how easily they revealed their true priorities. The longer I listened, the more a quiet resolve settled inside me. When I finally told them the ticket was in my name, the room froze. Their expressions collapsed into confusion, disbelief, and something close to panic. That silence lingered like a storm waiting to break, an opening crack in everything they thought they controlled, leading directly into the reckoning that was about to unfold. In the hours after they learned the ticket was in my name, Lydia and Andrew shifted into a new strategy. They started presenting themselves as calm, rational guides, offering suggestions about how someone my age should handle money. I could hear the careful phrasing, the rehearsed concern, the way they tried to steer my decisions without ever acknowledging how they had treated me before that moment. It was almost surreal watching them pretend to protect me while quietly positioning themselves to benefit. What they didn't know was that I had already begun preparing for the possibility that I might need to stand on my own. Weeks earlier, after one particularly exhausting day of chores and tension, I sat down with a notebook and wrote out every financial contribution I had made since moving in. Every grocery bill, every utility payment, every unexpected expense I covered without complaint. When I looked at the totals, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. I had given far more than I had ever received, not just in money but in time, energy, and emotional labor. Then came the twist I never expected. While sorting through old paperwork, I found a letter from Michael's attorney explaining that a private investigator had been hired months before he passed. Michael had worried about how I might be treated after his death, and he wanted to be certain I would be safe. The investigator's report confirmed every quiet fear I had tried to dismiss. Subtle patterns of manipulation, comments made behind my back, and financial behavior that suggested I was being viewed as a resource rather than a person. And then, the final revelation: a trust Michael had arranged, accessible only to me, meant to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone who didn't have my best interests at heart. The weight of that realization, his love contrasted with their exploitation, brought me to tears. But those tears hardened into resolve. I knew then that the time for silence had passed. I was ready to confront them, and the reckoning was coming. I walked into the living room that morning knowing exactly what I needed to say. For the first time in months, I felt steady in my own skin. Lydia and Andrew were already there, tense and watchful, trying to mask the anxiety simmering beneath their polite expressions. I could sense they were preparing yet another attempt to guide me, to keep a grip on a situation they no longer controlled. But I had come prepared, not for an argument, but for clarity. I started by laying out the truth piece by piece, the way you place cards on a table when there's nothing left to hide. I spoke about the unpaid labor, the endless chores, the financial contributions they never acknowledged. I watched their faces shift as they realized how much I had quietly absorbed. Then I told them about the investigator, how Michael, long before he passed, had sensed what I refused to see. The findings were undeniable. The comments behind my back, the subtle calculations, the early signs of exploitation they thought I would never uncover. Their composure cracked. I could see panic in the tightness of Lydia's jaw, confusion in the way Andrew's eyes darted toward the floor. And then I revealed the trust, the protection Michael had put in place, ensuring that I would never depend on the kindness of people who treated me like a burden. That truth landed heavier than anything else. They had built their hopes around controlling my future, and suddenly, that future no longer included them. As I spoke, I felt a deep, steady calm rise in me. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been. I was simply done. I told them I would be leaving, that I would no longer live in a home where I was diminished. Their silence followed me as I walked toward my room, a silence filled with the echoes of a life I was finally ready to step away from. What waited for me next was something entirely my own. Stepping into my new place felt like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. The quiet here is different, gentle, welcoming, free of the tension that used to cling to me the moment I woke up. I find myself moving through each day with a kind of calm I had almost forgotten. It reminds me that survival isn't just about enduring what hurts, but about choosing what heals. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't the labor or the money. It was losing sight of my own worth. Walking away forced me to reclaim it. I learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors we choose to close so we can finally open new ones. And I'm grateful. Grateful for the protection Michael left behind. Grateful for the strength I didn't know I still had. And grateful for the peace I'm settling into now. If you've ever had to step away from something that diminished you, I hope you know you're not alone. Have you faced a moment like this? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone,